Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode. Listen, before we get started, I just want to give you a few pieces of information. So, tonight, I'm going to be chatting with Jessica Lane, founder and CEO of Data Informed Impact. And we are talking all about that data trust factor. It's going to be a fantastic conversation. But before we dive in, I just have to remind you that in just 1 week, I'm going to be the opening keynote for CEC 2025. And the message that I am bringing is how to break down the silos, how to move beyond silos and create a culture of collaboration where every educator and every student thrives. If you want to bring this message to your next event or to a team where you think breaking down silos is something that needs to be talked about or needs to happen, then we need to connect. And you're going to hear at the end of the show exactly how you can connect with me. Now, with that said, we're going to jump into the conversation and learn about that data trust factor. Hey there, welcome to the Catching Up with Casey show. If you are tired of chasing buy-in, frustrated by teams who just can't seem to get on the same page, or over the constant struggle of holding people accountable without feeling like you're micromanaging, this is the show for you. I'm Casey Watts, team leadership expert and the host of this show. I specialize in clarity, collaboration, and character, and I help leaders just like you take teams from chaos to cohesion, from frustration to alignment, so teams can actually work together toward a common purpose instead of against each other as though they are functioning in different organizations. Whether you lead a single team or a team of teams, on this show, we talk about strategies that are going to help you create a culture where accountability and autonomy go hand in hand. Now, with all of that said, let's dive into today's conversation and build cohesive, vision-driven teams. Hey, Jessica Lane, welcome to the show.
Hi.
I'm so excited to have you.
Yeah. Hi, I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. So it's so interesting that we're having this conversation tonight because I know about a couple of things that are coming up. For me, tomorrow, I'm actually going to be at a region service center for a data conference here in Texas. Keynote speaker is going to be Jim Knight. I'm excited to shake his hand and hear from him. I'm also excited to present a couple of sessions myself. And I know you have a summit that has really actually just recently happened and another coming up. And I'm hoping you're going to share a little bit about that tonight. But first, Jessica Lane, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Jessica Lane. I am the founder of Data Informed Impact. I started this company back in 2020, so I've been running it for a while. It seems like yesterday, right? It seems like yesterday that all of that chaos happened. I actually started my business a couple weeks before COVID hit, so in February. And it was wild timing, that's for sure. But my background is all in education. I was a math educator. I'm from Cincinnati, but all my teaching experience was actually in Chicago. And so I worked at a very small charter school, right within city limits in West Garfield Park, and it was like law themed, which was so random, but really cool because I stepped in there the second year that they were open, and we were still building a lot of our systems, which was a really neat experience. So I had a lot of leadership experience there. I was there for 5 years, but it was such an impactful 5 years on my education career, on my life in general. But then I had a baby and I was like, wow, this is a lot to juggle right now, and with no family around. So myself and my ex-husband ended up moving back to Cincinnati. And I almost had a career change. I almost went into computer science because I love all things computer science. I've always loved playing around with spreadsheets. I love scripting. I loved my computer science courses in college. I was a math teacher, high school math teacher, so it makes sense, I guess. But when I came back, I started a degree in computer science and then got a call asking to be an instructional coach for the public school here in Cincinnati. And I was like, I can't leave education. There's no way. Like, as soon as someone offered it to me, I was like, okay, I'm back. As quickly switched my degree back over to my master's in learning and technology. And so I got my master's and continued working as an instructional coach for Cincinnati Public Schools. We were hired under an educational service center. They kind of cut ties with their instructional coaches about halfway through the year. And I was working on these grants for using data in schools for some of the schools that I was working with as an instructional coach. And I was like, this data coach position we're writing in sounds really interesting. I think I'd like that. And so I ended up getting a data coach position under that grant. And it was a 2-year temporary position. They didn't know a lot about what they wanted me to do, but they asked me to kind of start stepping into these meetings and helping these teachers collaborate around data. And I was stepping into these meetings. And I was like, okay, let's talk about data. And they're like, we got to fill out this form. And it was this Microsoft Word document, took forever to fill out, so tedious. And I was like, okay, I have a lot of downtime right now. I'm going to recreate this on Google Sheets. So I did, and I made it much easier for all of them so that we could spend the time actually reflecting on the data versus doing all of the tedious work beforehand. People started coming up to me. They're like, you should sell this. I'm like, no. I love my job. I don't want to do anything else, And then my boss came to me and she's like, no, really, like, you need to do this. There are schools that need someone who can do these things, who can make it much more efficient, easier for these teachers to use data. So I went viral in a couple Facebook groups. Things kind of took off right around COVID time, like I said. And I ended up staying at that district. They promoted me to district data coordinator, and I loved it. But then I guess it's been about 3 years ago now. Oh my goodness. I was just spending so much time driving, not enough time with my daughter. And I was like, I need to take a step back. I'm doing 2 jobs. I'm going to go full-time consulting. So rebranded, started working with not just data visualization, but also data culture and data literacy. And those are like my 3 pillars that I work with. And I'm doing it full time now. So I went full time last summer.
I love that. Yeah. So exciting and so needed too, because what you described about like just getting the checklist that you have to fill out, it is so time consuming and does little to nothing in regards to the impact that it has on student learning or even on culture itself. So tonight we're talking a lot about like the trust factor with data. Before we dive into that, I always like to visit with my guests with a this or that question, just to try to, see like, where do you stand with some things? And so one of these questions is going to be very just general life questions. And then the other is going to be tied to probably leadership and teams. So my first question for you is, when you are traveling, are you all in like, we're taking a road trip, we're going to drive hours on end and enjoy every minute of it? Or are you, we're going to get there as fast as we can and we're absolutely getting a flight?
Oh, that's a tough one. I like either of them. I think it depends on the situation. I feel like if I'm like going to the beach or somewhere where I'm going to have like a really relaxing time, then I want to just fly there, get there, have that relaxing time. But then if it's like an adventurous trip, I feel like the road trip is part of the adventure, right? So it kind of depends on what kind of trip I'm going on.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so second, if you are working...
You have to give me your answer.
I think, I had an answer and then you answered and I was like, oh yeah, maybe that's my answer. I can shift my thinking a little bit when people answer. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
but I mean, we traveled out west 2 or 3 years ago, my whole family, and it was an intentional like road trip because we were traveling to see like 7 different national parks. So, it made sense for us to drive, but, and it was fun. It was just exhausting, but, so here's my second question. When you're looking at data with teams, do you enjoy working most with a very, very small number of people on that team or a large team of people?
That's another tricky one. I really could do either. I like having a ton of different perspectives. I think there's a lot of value in that. And a large team, I don't shy away from a large team because there are, of course, opportunities to break up the team into different small groups and get stuff done that way. So I could go either way again. What about you?
Um, for me, I'm kind of the same. Like, I actually enjoy working with larger groups of people than smaller groups of people, and it depends on who's in the room too. It
Hmm.
definitely
Yep.
depends on who's in the room and what the topic is. But I always am interested in what people enjoy, like how people enjoy meeting with either teams or smaller groups of people. Like, I am a teams girl all the way. Love working with and facilitating teams.
Yep.
So let's say that you are meeting with teams tonight. We're talking all about data and trust. I know that sometimes teams can get together and there already is a little bit of skepticism and fear around data. What do you feel like causes that?
That's a great question. And I actually have a course on my website that's all about building trust and those data conversations and building that positive data culture. And the very first chapter I did, I have the video, I think I have it on YouTube for free. I think I put the first video on YouTube. It goes into like the all of the history of how we started using data in schools. And it stems back even to like the race to space. And the way that that impacted our legislators and our government to say, okay, we need people that are going to be very, very knowledgeable in STEM coming up because we want to beat everyone else and we want to be the best. And so then they're like, okay, well, how are we going to do that? We're going to make sure that our teachers are doing the things that they should be doing. So it all stemmed from like a place of accountability and a place of pressure. And so it goes way back, but even more recent, I think it's very related to the fear of math, right? Because you're talking about numbers. And it's funny because I was a math instructional coach, I was a math teacher. So I have a big passion for math. And I one time heard this lady speak at a conference. She goes by the math guru, Vanessa. I can't think of her last name. I just thought of this, but she talks extensively about how you almost need to go through like a math therapy to get rid of that defensiveness and that fear around data and around numbers. And it makes so much sense because so many people grew up thinking, oh, I'm not a math person, so I don't have to look at
Mhm.
numbers. And they were treated poorly because of that by math teachers. And there's all that background. So I think that kind of put us into two categories. There's either like I'm a math person or I'm not a math person, and then the not a math person is looking at the data and saying, oh, that's for the math people. So but even sometimes the math people are nervous because it's often used against them. When
Yeah.
do they see data the most? In evaluations and state test scores. Like it's always, what are you doing wrong?
Yeah.
And that's the shift that we're trying to make.
Yeah, that is so true. I think we hear the term data, however you however you want to approach saying it, but we hear that term, and people have these narratives created based on their experiences that they've had in the past, and we don't really have control over the narratives or experiences that they're coming with. And when I think about when that data is either analyzed or presented, it is typically based on standardized things.
Yep.
And so I am sure that that is a huge part of, just because it's a part of what people have experienced. They don't have any other experiences. That's what they're coming to the table with. And that's what may cause some of that fear. I am fascinated by your story, or the origin story of the data. So interesting to me, and I'm gonna have
Yeah,
to look
it's
more into that.
wild. And
Yeah.
As you're talking, I'm thinking there's another half of that I think is worth mentioning, and that's the fact that like we don't go into teaching to label students with numbers, right? If we're in teaching and we are actually passionate about what we're doing it for the student, and we see them as individuals. We don't see them as numbers. So,
Hmm.
and I'm sure that'll come up several times in this conversation. I'm a big believer in data informed, but people driven. And I think that there's a lot of value in making sure that we're not just looking at the numbers. We have to balance out that numbers with the actual context, with our teacher intuition, with all the other things that make us amazing educators.
Yeah, you are speaking to my heart. Like when I first connected with you and learned that your business is data informed impact, it just made my heart so happy. That's the term that I've been leaning into for the last several years, because we we are in a human centered business.
Yes.
So let's talk about the culture of our schools, kind of thinking about data informed versus data driven and more people driven. People create the culture of our schools, but we still have to have data conversations. So how do you feel like leaders can create a culture of trust around data, like shift that narrative a little bit?
Yeah, I have lots of tips that I give leaders when we start. It's funny because a lot of these conversations stem from me building data platforms, dashboards, or whatever, and then leaders saying, "Okay, thank you," and sending it out to their teams, and then I come back like several weeks later. I'm like, "How's it going?" And it's just like crickets because nobody's looking at it and nobody's using it. Which is actually what prompted me to start working with data culture and data literacy as well. So now we're having much more conversation centered around how do you plan to roll this out in a way that's going to be valuable for your staff and feel like it's actionable. What I found is that a lot of times we have these data meetings just to check the box, and we never come back to it. There's no real follow up. And so then the next one comes around, it's like, oh, I know what this is going to be. Like, I'll sit down here, I'll pretend to work on this data for a second, and then I'll throw this in the pile of paper on my desk. Like, and then eventually it'll go
Mhm.
in the trash. I've done that as a teacher, so I've been there. I know how it is. Yeah. Um,
Guilty.
if there's no follow up, then there's no reason to make it a priority when you have a million other things on your plate. So I always say make it roll whatever data you plan to use. You want to roll it out in the moment. I shouldn't be getting up in front of your staff talking about a data dashboard that they're not going to use ever. It should be, okay, we're in a team meeting. This is a time that we typically would look at data. Let's pull it up. Let's actually use the dashboard in the moment. So a lot of it is making sure that you're building in that training at a time where it feels actionable. And then beyond that, it's all about making your teachers feel as though you trust them as educators. Going with a slow rollout, making sure that you're starting slow, making sure that you're very transparent about whether or not this is something that we are using for evaluations or not using for evaluations. I tell people that it's probably not the best idea to hold accountability meetings where you pull a teacher in and look at a piece of data um, and make decisions just based on the numbers.
Mhm.
You want to also make sure, like I said, that you're having conversations about the context. I When I first started data coaching, I was asked to send out this data to the staff like every other week. It was iReady data, and it didn't go over very well. Obviously, I learned a lot. And so I called them all into a meeting on one of our PD days, and I said, okay, I'm putting this data up on the board, and then I'm going to step over to the side with my marker and the whiteboard, and you're going to tell me everything that we don't see on this data. Like everything that you can think of that is not being encapsulated by the numbers that we're seeing right now. And so I stood up there and wrote things down like, oh, this group is actually working on enrichment, so they won't have as much iReady data. This group has very low attendance. And this group, we had a student who was expelled recently, so that's hurting our numbers, or we have students that are on our list that aren't actually here. And then so goofy, but it worked so well. I literally made them all stand up. I was like, stand up, put your right hand up in the air. I was like, this all promise that when we look at this data, we're remembering that it doesn't show everything. There's a lot
Yep.
of other stuff that we are not seeing when we look at this data. This data is a starting point, but it's definitely not the end all be all. And
Yep.
you all know that. I know that. Central office knows that. We just need to say it, and we need to continuously remind ourselves that there are other factors that aren't necessarily showing up within that data.
Yeah, that is, and teachers appreciate that so much. Like I have said something similar to teachers before, just because it, and specifically with state testing, with state or standardized testing, it's because it seems like that end all, the big thing that we're all working up towards. It feels like it's so weighty and important when it really it's a piece of the story. But you can see like a physical reaction in them when you have that conversation and that transparency. Um, so Curtis is here with us tonight. Hey, Curtis. He said, I love the Mark Twain quote. Data is like garbage. You better know what you're going to do with it before you begin collecting it. He said he's
Yes.
paraphrasing, but that's the gist of it. And I love that too. Yeah, it's so true. As you were talking about just like trying to shift people from checking things, being the checkers, like checking things
Yep.
off the list, I write about and talk about clarity and creating clarity. And this is one of those situations where it is so necessary to create the clarity when you are rolling out something like this. But those are conversations that need to be had in order to build trust, in order to have effective data meetings. Let's talk about the difference between using data to guide versus using it to decide, which I feel like really goes well with what you just said because there are so many things that we have to consider.
Yeah, it really is about letting the data kind of take you on the journey versus be the end of the journey. It's starting with the data instead of ending with it.
Mm-hmm.
How many other ways can I say this? No, I'm just kidding. I feel like I have a list of like ways that I say it to people. It's all about making sure that, like you said, you're taking into account all of those additional factors, all of that additional context, and making sure that you are acknowledging that student is a human. Those students are humans, right? Like there's you're never going to be able to figure out much about a student by looking at a test score. So yes, definitely using data, but not letting it be the answer to the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fantastic. I wrote down, let the data take you on the journey. It's not the end of the journey. Such a powerful
Yeah.
statement. So, earlier you were sharing about some of your work with not only the schools that you worked with as a data coach, but your work now too with your business and trying to get people collaborating around the data, which I know is can be a feat. Um, so, how practically does it look to make these meetings feel a little bit more
Mhm.
collaborative?
Um, and I thought about this too when you were talking about the state test data. I always tell people if you want to get your teachers on board, you want to start with the tiniest data possible. And that's like if we consider that state assessment data, that's like that huge data, right? And then you go a little bit
Mhm.
smaller and you're looking at the diagnostic data or the screening data. But if you really want to feel the impact of using data to help guide your instruction or guide your decision making within your school, you're going to be looking at that tiny data, and the tinier you can get, the better it is. If we're talking about, of course, the tiniest is if you're working like one-on-one instructional coaching with a teacher on that day-to-day data. But if we're looking at teams, the tiniest we can get is probably within intervention cycles. So you're looking at data, every 6 to 8 weeks within a team, and you're making decisions based on that data. I have a presentation that I love to give. Every time I give it, it like gives me chills, and I feel like there's so much that you can take away from it. And it's all about the journey that I went on with the district that I was in most recently. And we ended up bringing their elementary school out of improvement status. And we did it in a very systematic way. We started very small and we began looking at intervention data for very small groups of students in our team meetings. I say our as if it was totally the elementary school. They deserve all the credit in the world. I built the systems for it. I learned a ton from them. But these teachers were looking at this data, and what we noticed was that even though only a few of them were actually piloting this system, they were starting to celebrate the growth that students were making, and the others started to look at it and say, oh, maybe I want to celebrate my students' growth also. And it's hard to see that growth if you're only looking at classroom assessments, if you're only looking at diagnostics. It's so much harder to see that growth. And in that presentation, I have videos of data meetings that teachers had, and listening to them talk about, oh, the student's gaining confidence finally, or this student wasn't doing well in class, but we started pulling up for small groups and started working with them on these skills. And not only were they behaving better in the small groups, their behavior started to get better in school, in their general education class as well. Talking about parents that were getting hyped about their students and noticing a difference when their students were coming home from school, about how positive they were about going to school. It was having an impact on our attendance, behavior. And the coolest thing too was that, you know, that district's very small. It's elementary, middle, high, and then one alternative virtual school. And out of all four of those schools, that elementary school had the least amount of turnover across the past several years.
Wow.
And so the teachers not only were bought in, they were also sticking around for it. And I think that says a ton. And they were also joining the MTSS team, which was voluntary. It's just really neat. See, I get the chills again. It's really neat to watch it happen when it's done so beautifully. And they really, really did a good job. I was there to support, but I can't take all the credit. Those teachers were amazing. And the way that the instructional coach and the rest of the teaching and learning team took over that system, it worked so beautifully. So starting small, gaining that buy-in, looking at that tiny data so that you can get that celebration and just get that motivation to look at more.
Yeah, and that tiny sliver of data sometimes is even more, I'm just gonna say it is more important than the high stakes data that you might get. Man, I love hearing about everything that you said. Like, not a bit of it had to do with, I mean, yes, it had to do with academics, but it was so people and human centered. Everything, every benefit of it was so human centered, and I love that so much. Okay, so I know that, you know, just in working with so many different schools and teachers, and the things that are on their plates just feels like so much, and I get it, and it's probably just continuously feeling like more and more. And I think sometimes when we hear the term data meetings, data conversations, those kinds of things, we're collecting data, whatever it might be, it feels overwhelming to teachers. Feels like we're just adding to the plate. So how can schools ensure that data informs instruction instead of just overwhelming teachers and feeling like it's one more thing?
Yeah, I think that goes back to really starting with that one-on-one coaching, or those very small teams, and looking at that small data. I always say, if you have one teacher in particular who's struggling with, you know, how do I use data to inform my instruction? I'm not sure what you want from me. I just get asked to bring something to a meeting and I don't know what to bring. I think a lot of the work can happen in those coaching meetings. So it's about like sitting down with the teacher, coming up with some kind of reteaching plan if the data isn't what they want it to be, and then maybe even supporting them in implementing that reteaching plan, and then coming back and looking at the follow-up data so that they can see, oh, I did that. Like we made that plan, I did that, and now my students did so much better. And again, having that celebration moment so that you can then be motivated to look at the next set of data. And I talked earlier about how I created that spreadsheet that did everything for them. And I love to call it a habit building tool, because I really think it's all about just getting into that habit of looking at data. It doesn't have to be that every teacher's putting data into a spreadsheet and typing up a reteaching plan. Some teachers, they do it a couple times and it's like, okay, now I get it. Now I know how to use it. Or like when I was a
Mm-hmm.
teacher, I remember I would give a very short assessment to my students, and I would have an assignment that they would work on. As soon as they were done with this assessment, they would just put the paper up, and I'd be walking around categorizing paper in my hand. Like, yes, they get it. They made one tiny mistake. I just need to stop by and remind them of something, or I need to pull them to the back for a small group. And that's using data, right? You're looking at how
Yeah.
many of my students know what they're doing and how many of my students need a little bit of extra to get them there, or need reteaching altogether. So it looks a million different ways, but it's all about building that habit and knowing that what you're doing is actually working, and feeling that moment of celebration when it does.
Yeah, yeah, that we are so aligned in that, thinking about habits and building habits versus just doing things to check it off a list. Those habits are so important. I don't think we recognize that how impactful habits can be if you're building them intentionally. Um, Curtis asked a question that I would love for you to share your thoughts on. What do you feel are the best ways to gain momentum for teams in using and eventually being excited about data?
It all goes back to those moments of celebration. They've got to feel that excitement, and that excitement's not going to come from the process. It's just not,
Hmm.
unless they're like me. I mean, I love filling out spreadsheets, so I will get excited about that, but I recognize that that is not what most people like to do with their free time. So, yeah, it's not about the process. It's about holding their hand through the process so that they can get that feeling of celebration and then get
Yeah.
excited about it.
Yeah, absolutely. They need those mastery experiences for sure to continue to want to engage in any kind of data conversation. Um, so I want to start to wrap up, and I have two questions that I want to ask you before we do wrap up. You talked about transparency earlier in this episode, and I just want to revisit that briefly and have you share anything else that's on your mind about the role of transparency in building data trust, or how leaders can start to build more trust in data teams.
Um, yeah, I will say that it starts with being a part of that process through and through, being that instructional leader. If you're coming in at the last minute and looking at data and then trying to make decisions about your teachers, or um, uh, formulate thoughts and opinions about your teachers based on that, I think that's where the disconnect comes from, and that's when your teachers start to feel very defensive about what's going on.
Mhm.
So just being a part of that, and making sure that it doesn't look like, again, you're just trying to check a box.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I That's in my clarity cycle book, or the craft of clarity book. I talk about bridging those narrative gaps between, either leaders and teachers, or whoever the adults are in the building. But this is one of those situations because and I think it is just a natural thing that we do. We have immediate perceptions or perspectives or make immediate assumptions. It's just the way that our brain works. But we can't, and it's so funny. I had a conversation with my daughter about this yesterday, but we can't hold on to those assumptions as fact or as truth. We have to confront them. And I think what you're saying, and just being a part of those conversations from the ground level up, is so important. Okay, this has been you've dropped so many truth bombs, so many gold nuggets. I love it so much. What I want to know, listeners, let us know either on LinkedIn, send us a message, or if you are watching this on YouTube, leave us a comment. We want to know what was most useful for you today and what it is that you are going to take action on. And then can you tell us, Jessica, what you hope listeners will take away from this conversation?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just recognizing that, again, the data isn't, all the answers aren't found in the data. It's about making sure that you are balancing it out with the context and with that teacher intuition. And if you're a leader, recognizing that your teachers have important things that they need to contribute, important facts and knowledge that they need to contribute to those conversations, and backing off from that data says all mindset. Yes. For sure.
That's awesome. And where can our listeners find you?
All over. So my website is data-informedimpact.com. I am I'd say most active on LinkedIn, but my handle is @InformedImpact everywhere. So LinkedIn, Twitter, refuse to call it X, Facebook, Pinterest. I send it to everywhere. So that's where you can usually find me.
Yeah, and you have to tell us before we go about the summit.
Yeah, for sure. So I host a summit, a virtual summit. My summit in June will be the third one. So I actually started it last June. It's Data and Education, a virtual summit. And it's usually around 25 speakers coming in and talking all about how to use data. We look at data visualization. So we look into, scripting, Google Sheets, dashboards. We look at data culture, a lot of the stuff that we talked about today, data literacy, putting into place those systems for your schools and for your teachers. So it's a really neat experience to just be able to listen to a ton of people contribute a ton of different ideas about how to use data, because it's never one size fits all. So it's neat to hear all the different perspectives. And so I have the next one coming up in June. I think it's June 10th and 11th. I'm pretty sure. And so you can find the link to that. It's all over all of my social, and it's on my website. I do also want to talk about, I have a data coach collaborative. I had a pilot group, and then I just started my first official cohort. We're meeting 6 times every other week. Not 6 times every other week, but 6 times total every other week.
Right.
That would be insane. And just a ton of resources, a ton of cool things. So you can get on the wait list for the next cohort. You can find that on my website as well.
Yeah. And guys, that all of this will be in the show notes too. So if you are hearing something that's that you are interested in, you never say things and you're like, that's not the way to say that. And then I find myself talking about it in the moment, and I'm like, you should probably stop talking about it in the moment. Yeah. Anyway,
I do the same thing.
But you guys can find all of this in the show notes if you are interested. Okay, Jessica, thank you for coming on tonight. This has been such a great conversation. Yeah. And guys, we'll catch you next week. Bye.
Bye, thanks.
Hey there, thanks for joining this episode. I would love for you to do me 3 solid favors before you head out. Number 1, subscribe to this show. I've got a lot of great guests and content coming up, and I don't want you to miss any of it. Number 2, share this show. Share it with your like-minded colleagues and friends, and those leaders who are eager to build cohesive, vision-driven teams. And finally, connect with me on all the social media platforms. You can find me at Catch Up with KC on Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Until next time, go off and create teams that leave people feeling inspired, empowered, and eager for more each day.